largest recession since 1929, faced with what I regard as the impossibility of any sort of recovery outside of a very large public investment, because I think it's fundamentally a crisis that is caused by the desertion of the sphere of investment by private investors, which is why I'm not optimistic about a rapid recovery, at least in the developed countries. So I have a project which I call Investing in Civilization, in which the central idea is the state and public bodies in general, which of course go wider than the state, will have to play a much larger role in the economy if there's going to be a recovery. But also the nature of the economy has changed, so that the service sector, mental, spiritual, cultural activity are playing a much, much, much larger role than is recognised by our current modes of thinking. Therefore, the new form of investment will have to be much more an investment in what we now call art, although I prefer a more general term, culture, than ever before. And this will require, revolutions in thought. For me, if one is going to investigate anything systematically, the first thing you have to do is understand what it is that you are investigating, and that's got two aspects. One is, what is the object? It's a sort of question of meaning, epistemological study. I characterise myself now as an epistemological anthropologist. So I'm walking amongst all the tribes of people who are engaged in art and science and politics and economics, and trying to ask them, what do you mean by art? What do you mean by culture? What do you mean by music, for example? Not an easy question. And so that's the first thing. And then the second thing is to say, well, if side by side with meaning you study measurement, then you begin to have a systematic study. You have a science, as I would call it, Wissenschaft in the German sense, pursuit of systematic knowledge. And so the interest in measurement arises from that more general interest of developing systematic method of study, systematic methods of study that will allow us to formulate policies that will deal with this big historic problem we now face, both economic and social and moral. And I wouldn't say that as yet anything has emerged where I could say, right, this is what you do. I think that the more I study, the more I find that there are insoluble problems, unsolved, not insoluble, problems that are not yet amenable to any immediate solution. So the most interesting work that I have found that is going on, and there are studies going on over the whole world, two places. One is the Queensland University of Technology, where it's the nearest thing you have to an institution who is dedicated to the study of culture in the sense of investigating what makes it work as well as simply what it is. And the second is our own Department of Culture, Media and Sport in the UK, where they became very interested in the work that I presented at this and that Radhika presented here, and set up that they already had a very interesting body called CASE, and they have been for a long time investigating a whole series of studies into cultural behaviour, cultural engagement, cultural activity, which has produced some very interesting results. They became very interested in the notion of measuring intrinsic value, which is one of the areas of measurement we're concerned with. And they engaged a researcher called David O'Brien, who has produced a tremendous report, which is only an intermediate report. Now, on the basis of that, what we're trying to do at DCMS is to bring forward the study of how the arts may themselves be measured. And the interesting point that I would draw attention to is that in other spheres of economic and social activity, it's actually perfectly normal to attempt to measure the intrinsic, non-revealed value of public spending. For example, transport is my favourite example. Transport investment in Britain is judged according to a methodology that's laid out in a thing called the Treasury Green Book. The Treasury Green Book is a huge manual of procedures which basically derives from an area of economic research called cost-benefit analysis. Cost-benefit analysis is an attempt to measure the so-called welfare benefits and costs, as well as the monetary benefits and costs of an investment. And one of the things you study when you put in a new line of transport is what effect it will have on people's lives, if their journeys to work will be more pleasant or less pleasant, shorter or longer, whether they will be able to do things that they couldn't previously do, and how much they think that's worth. So there's a whole set of specifications as to how, when you're evaluating a transport project, you should evaluate what society's welfare will be. The curious thing is that the Green Book applies across the board. So any call on public funds, if it's going to be correctly stated for the British Treasury, should involve use of Green Book methods. But each department is supposed to develop its own manual of procedure that says how you should apply Green Book methods in our particular field. So there is a manual of procedure for transport, there's a manual of procedure for building, as far as I know, and I believe there is one now developed for health, but there is no manual of procedure for the arts. So one of the things that I, involved in the steering board of this, suggested was that to develop the research, one should actually develop a manual of procedure for the Culture Ministry. So it's a very concrete area of investigation, and advise anybody who's interested in it to follow the progress of this. David O'Brien's excellent paper is available on the web. People should find it. I have not caught up with the latest developments, but I know that there's a process of appointment of a research fellow to continue that work. And the nice thing about that work is that it's considering all possible ways, because there are 5 or 6, to my knowledge, different ways of approaching this method of this issue of estimating the welfare benefits of art or culture. I'm not going to come down on the side of either one or the other, or I do have some views about the matter. Rather, I'm going to say that my own thinking on it has taken a step back. And this was partly because, in discussion with the chief economist at DCMS at the time, an excellent researcher called Anita Charlesworth, who came to that ministry from the health ministry, what I think I began to realise was that you cannot develop a good measure or a good way of measuring what any given community does without interacting with that community, so that it itself is engaged in the definition. You cannot superimpose on a community any method of measurement that it does not itself engage with and recognise. And that, by the way, is perfectly standard scientific economic practice. To me, good economics is, by its nature, empirical. You begin from the facts, something a lot of economists rather seem to have taken their departure from. So all my work while I was at the Greater London Authority involved going and seeing what the arts actually did, talking to the arts community. The lines along which I'm now working is that I think industries themselves generate measures. There are measures that they should generate and they don't. So I asked at the beginning of my session here, how many of you actually use numbers? And it was a very interesting response, because the majority did use numbers, but only in order to advocate, or only in order to interest funders, not in order to assess for themselves, for their own purposes, what they were actually doing. And so the first thing I think has to be done is to get arts measuring, get them doing what I call evaluating what they do. I think that measures of the value that art contributes will then come out of that through a dialogue, a four-way dialogue between the arts communities, the arts funders, very important, policy makers, and the economists or the investigators. Maybe the economists sort of disqualified themselves as investigators, but somebody who who brings to the table a systematic method of study, a Wissenschaft. So I think that the answer to the question is that there is no method as yet. There are a number of candidates which DCMS is in the process of identifying, along with QUT and other centres of research throughout the world. I'm only identifying 2 or 3. There needs to be a research process which will bring all those people together, and that identifying the best measure will come out of that. The first is the measures themselves. And it's not so much a problem as a wonderful discovery that there are numbers everywhere when it comes to the arts world. And all one has to do is get people to write them down and record them. There's always some barrage de richesse. There's too many numbers around, and the problem is to interpret them, which was not what one expected. One expected when we started this, actually, it can be terribly hard to measure what theatres do. Then we find, count the number of theatres, count the number of seats, count the number of tickets sold, count the number of tickets sold for performance of different genres, count the number of people who come on a Saturday afternoon, count the demographics of the people who come, count the postal codes they come from, count the length of their journey. Audience research is just a huge field. So there are indicators galore. The difficulty is that the meaning of those indicators is different for everybody. So the problem is to produce generalizable knowledge from those indicators, which again is an issue of bringing together the different communities. In some cases, there's quite an evolved understanding. So I think in the sphere of audience mapping, there's actually what I think could legitimately be called expertise in audience mapping. People actually have a very good idea how to interpret audience figures. Not everybody has that knowledge, so it needs to be codified and disseminated, one of the things we're talking about in our paper, rather than just made a mystery. But I have no doubt that the successful theatre manager certainly has an extremely good understanding of how to interpret audience figures and use them to produce a viable mix of different genres, different times of performance, different audiences, different targeting, and so on. In other areas, understanding is only just beginning. I think museums are only really just beginning now, a big voyage of discovery about what it is exactly they do. And that's, to some extent, because they don't talk to each other. They don't actually have a common language about museology. It's not, I could be doing it in injustice, I just don't get the impression that it's an exact science. Now that's, exactitude is anathema to the arts, but there are things they could do a lot more exactly than they are now. And what I mean by that is they could make their measures comparable. So perhaps delete the word exact, or you can include my hesitations, but I think the comparability is the real problem. How do you bring together a set of museum figures, let's say from an art gallery in Tokyo, where the visitors go past the paintings at, I think we were told 4 times the rate they go past in London, and interpret visitor figures for museums or exhibits in Tokyo and figures for museum or art gallery exhibits in London in such a way that the conclusions we draw from both figures have meaning to both groups of people. So it's the attribution of meaning and interpretation of figures to produce common results is difficult. That's the first thing. And cultural relativism is not just a buzzword, it's a reality. Culture is different in each city, and therefore the same number does not tell you exactly the same thing. So one has to have a process of abstraction that allows you to work out what conclusions are of a general nature and what are not of a general nature. There's a conflict between relativism and comparability. Second thing is, I think many people don't actually understand that comparability is an issue. And I'll give you an example of this, that when we started the work on the cultural audit, we had a discussion when we were moving to funding the second round of the cultural audit. And it was very interesting because the first round of the cultural audit was funded by a Labour administration, and then a Conservative administration came in, which has actually funded the second round, but you have a different discussion with the two generations of public servants. The Conservative administration, it was, I don't think this is an unfair characterisation, had an approach I would characterise as localist. So what it was interested in was London, and it was interested in its constituency and the people who you are speaking to, the members of the Assembly, because we don't have elections on a proportional basis, we have them on representing a certain geographical area, came to us and said, look, I know my constituency, I know my area of London, and therefore what I want is that this audit that you conduct should as accurately as possible reflect the knowledge that I have, that my constituents have, that my local theatres have, that my local performers have. So, okay. So we said, well, there's a problem here, because what you'll produce is London's definition of London, but you've got to compare yourself with Paris. So how are you going to compare yourself with Paris? Well, the answer seems to be that you'll go and get the Parisians to do the same exercise. They know their city, they know what they will count their figures, and they will come up with their measure. But the problem is the two measures of them being constructed on a different basis. So they're not comparable. So we then had a big engagement with a wonderful body called IORIF, which is the Île-de-France statistical region, and we worked together to produce at least a mapping of the creative industries, which doesn't cover the whole of culture, in London and Paris on identical basis. And we're now going to produce a joint report. And because the measurement of the creative industries in the two cities has used the same definition, we will directly be able to draw accurate comparisons, such as, are there in fact more people engaged in producing music in Paris or in London? Because we strove from the outset to have a measure that was common to the two cities. So the notion of comparability is subtly different from the notion of accuracy. We produce a comparable measure that's not entirely satisfactory to Parisians and not entirely satisfactory to Londoners, because it's not localist, but it allows us to make the comparisons. We're now attempting to expand that concept to as many cities as possible, and if one thinks the difficulties of comparing Paris and London are large, I mean, imagine comparing London with Johannesburg or Rio or whatever. It's huge. But the aim is to establish a community of cities which will talk to each other in such a way that they can combine attention to and recognition of relativism, that culture genuinely and really is relative. There's a local dimension to all culture, which is to be respected and encouraged. And diversity itself is to be welcomed and measured, which is not an easy thing to do. And that the need to be able to produce results which can be as widely used as possible, so that comparability is an objective. So the summary of the whole thing is that the fascination of cultural measurement is the reconciliation of the objective, the policy objective of diversity, and the policy objective of being able to learn from experience and generalise conclusions, which means the requirement of comparability. And in the measurement area, that leads to the reconciliation of localism and comparability. And Datapedia obviously conjures up ideas of Wikipedia, and the point that I'm trying to explain to people is you can't do Datapedia in the same way you do Wikipedia, because the nature of data is not the same as the nature of text. So that when you go into Wikipedia, you will change one part of the text, and you're just changing that part. I mean, there is some passage afterwards for general consistency of the text, but you can just let one edit sit. When you make a change to a piece of data, the whole of the field of the data changes at once. If I change the number that tells me the number of people who are working in music in London, every figure in the whole economic spreadsheet or data set I'm using that depends on that number will also change. The size of employment in the creative industries in London, the number of musicians throughout the UK, the number of musicians throughout the world, the number of musicians in Europe, all those numbers will change. So the Datapedia problem is how to obtain a mechanism that will allow you to reconcile many different to have available at the same time the many different definitions corresponding to the different cultural concepts that arise from cultural relativism, whilst at the same time working to achieve comparability. And the key to that is that the users, as well as providing numbers, must provide meanings, classifications, and then they must have a discussion about the meanings and the classifications at the same time they're discussing the numbers. And that's what we hope to do, so if you like it, join us.